Today I want to talk to you about the process of modding my Keychron K8 keyboard. This experience was largely informed by what I learned while modding my Keychron K6, so if you haven't seen that video, I recommend watching it first, and I'll link to it in the description. That being said, I will try to make this video stand alone as well as I can. I want to give a little guidance on the keyboards and the mods that can be performed before we jump into the mods themselves. I can see this being a very attractive first board to newcomers to the hobby due to the 10 keyless layout that it shares with many other gaming keyboards. I will first list the modifications I performed, so if you're already familiar with the hobby, you can jump straight to what you're interested in using the timestamps on screen. However, if you do want the guidance, you can stick around and watch the whole video. In chronological order, here are the mods I performed. First, I replaced the stock Gateron Red switches with ZLPC Telios switches. Second, I lubricated the switches, and then I cleaned, clipped, re-lubricated, and Band-Aid modified the stabilizers. Third, I filled the case of the keyboard with neoprene foam. And fourth, I replaced the stock ABS keycaps with aftermarket PBT keycaps. I didn't perform these mods in this order, because that's necessarily the best order to do them in yourself, or they have the most impact on the keyboard that way. I did them in that order to record sound tests along the way for this video, which will be at the end. So, first, some guidance for beginners. If all you want to do is replace the keycaps and key switches, you never actually need to take the keyboard apart so long as you get a hot swappable model. The only mod that requires you to take the keyboard completely apart is to install foam in the chassis. All in all, this is a board I would recommend to newcomers to the hobby, both due to its ease of modification, but also its creature comforts, like USB-C charging, wired or wireless connectivity, and fast OS switching between macOS and Windows. If for budget reasons, time reasons, tool availability, anything like that, you can only perform one or some of these mods, this is the order I'd recommend performing them in. First, I would replace the stock ABS keycaps with something higher quality, be it nicer ABS keycaps like GMK makes, or a set of PBT keycaps like I have here you can get on AliExpress or KBD fans. Replacing the keycaps is dead simple, the tool's in the box, and it can make a really big impact on the sound performance of the keyboard. In the sound tests at the end, I've recorded an additional one this time, where it's just replacing the keycaps and nothing else, so you can hear what that difference sounds like. Second, I would recommend replacing and lubricating the key switches. At least in linears, there's not a lot of switches out there that dry are going to be a huge improvement over Gateron Reds, and if you can only replace them or lube them, I'd honestly recommend just lubricating the Gateron Reds that come in the box. Once again, I'll link to Taeha Type's tutorial on how to lubricate key switches, as he will do a much better job explaining it than I will. Third, I would fill the case with foam. This is far and away the most involved of the modifications, as it requires completely disassembling the keyboard, but on keyboards like the Keychron K8 and K6 that I modified previously, it really does make a big difference because they have quite cavernous chassis. And fourth, I would clean, clip, re-lubricate, and Band-Aid mod the stabilizers. Out of the box, the Keychron stabilizers are already lubricated, and this really didn't make a big difference on this one. I even completely replaced the stabilizers, and it still didn't make that big of a difference on this board. Alright, now I'll break down the mods as I completed them, along with the things I learned along the way. Replacing the switches was dead easy on this board, just as it was on the Keychron K6, because they're both hot swappable boards. I will evangelize here for getting a better switch puller. The one the Keychron comes with is really just more work than it's worth. Novel Keys and many other vendors sell a switch puller like this one that makes the job much easier. I will also note again that because the top plate of the Keychron is actually the mounting plate for the switches, be careful when pulling the switches out, as the switch puller might scratch that top surface. I went with the ZLPC Telios switches on this keyboard, as I completely fell in love with the Roselios that I put on my K6. However, I don't need the sound dampening, since this will be a keyboard that I use at home. Since the Gateron Reds and ZLPC Telios switches are both linear and both have a similar actuation force, I really didn't notice a lot of difference with just this step. The sound might have been a little bit lower, and the typing experience might have been a little bit more consistent, but really, it was still pretty similar to stock. Out of the box, my K8 had a pretty soft bottom out on the spacebar, and this didn't change when replacing the switches, so I assumed it was probably over-lubricated stabilizers from the factory. More on this later. Lubricating and filming the switches was accomplished with Krytox 205 Grade 0 lubricant and Desky's switch films. I'll once again link to the Taeha Type's tutorial on lubricating switches, as he'll do a much better job explaining it than I will. The switch films are inserted between the halves of the housing during the lubrication process, and they result in the housing having a tighter fit, giving a more consistent sound and feel to the keyboard. This was far and away the most effective modification on this keyboard, and it really made it sing. The Telio switches, especially after about 2 weeks of breaking them in, are a total pleasure to type on and listen to. Dry Telios do have a pretty noticeable spring ping out of the box, so even if you don't want to film your switches, which is pretty tedious and adds a good amount of time to the process, I highly recommend at least lubricating them. While I had the switches out, I replaced the stabilizers with Zeal PC stabilizers. I clipped, lubricated, and Band-Aid modded them following Taeha Type's tutorial, link in the description, and I can confidently say this was the least effective mod of the bunch. It didn't really change the feel of the keys or the sound at all. If anything, I would just recommend removing the factory stabilizers, cleaning them, and re-lubricating them, since they come way over-lubricated from the factory. Filling the case with foam is where things got interesting. On the K6, there's 2 screws that hold the PCB to the plate on the keyboard. On the K8, these screws are not present. The PCB rests inside the case, the plate sits on top of the standoffs and then screws into them, and then when the switches go through the plate and into the PCB, that's what holds the two together. So if, like me, you just removed the screws from the plate and tried to pull the whole thing out at once, you ended up pulling out this wobbly, flexible PCB plate sandwich, and that does not go well. The parts flex and wobble as you try and pull them out, and they end up just getting wedged in the case. So if you're doing this, learn from my mistake, just remove all the switches. Obviously, if you didn't get one of the hot swap versions of the board, you have to remove everything at once, so I might recommend just flipping the whole keyboard upside down to try to get everything to come out as straight as possible. Interestingly, once I got my K8 open, the battery was completely improperly mounted. There's clearly a little space in the case where it's supposed to go, and it was mounted crooked and over one of these ribs. It wasn't good. Fortunately, it popped off pretty easily, so I was able to remount it in place safely. Also interestingly, the battery on the K8 has a plastic shield on the top that is not present on the K6. I assume this is to stop the PCB from coming in contact with the battery during vigorous typing. Just like last time, I cut my 5mm neoprene foam to size to fit between the ribs of the chassis for one layer, and then on the second layer I cut the largest pieces I could fit to fill in even more of the space. 2 layers, just like on the K6, once again fit perfectly. I didn't have to put any pressure on the PCB, and everything fit together just fine. This made a massive difference in the K8, I think even more than the K6, due to the larger size of the chassis. It made the sound of the whole keyboard just a little bit lower and a little bit thockier, I guess is the word we're all agreeing to use. Unlike the K6, the K8 has a little safe area around the switches and USB-C connector, so it's very obvious not to put foam there. And also, just like on my K6, I didn't put any foam where the power connector on the battery rests when everything's reassembled, which once again is just below the left foot of the keyboard. Switching out the keycaps once again came last and easiest. There's a tool included in the box with the K8 to remove the keycaps. This time, I went even mellower on the keycaps, as I wanted this one to have a little bit more of a subdued look, and I wanted the artisan I'm using to be the star of the show. I replaced the stock ABS keycaps with these PBT keycaps that are dye sublimated from KBD fans. I really like the subdued look of the keyboard and the large legends on the alpha keys. For the artisan on this keyboard, I got this really cool keycap from Papa Cap on Etsy. It's a recreation of Buzz Aldrin's famous footprint on the moon. I've dubbed this keyboard Blue Moon, due to the blue stems on the Telio switches, the lunar-colored keycaps, the artisan, and as a bonus, one of my favorite songs is Blue Moon. Replacing the keycaps had quite a noticeable impact on the sound of the board. The PBT keycaps are 1.5mm thick, whereas the ABS keycaps are really quite thin. I also really like the way these keycaps feel under my fingers, as they've got a little bit of texture to them. I did learn 2 interesting things while replacing the keycaps on this board. First, on the K8, the aluminum frame around the edge is just a little too tight for the oversized artisan to sit on the escape key. It binds against the metal frame while typing. This isn't an issue on the K6, interestingly, so the frame might just be a little bit tighter, and it's not an issue where it sits on the tilde key. Second, after swapping the spacebar, it just completely got stuck. I would press it down and it would not return, and I had to pull it back up manually. I'm not totally sure why this happened. To troubleshoot, I flipped the spacebar over, I took the stabilizer out, cleaned it, lubricated it more lightly, I swapped the switch out for a different Telio, Telii, and none of it mattered. Eventually, I did swap back to the original stabilizer. It still got stuck, but then I flipped it over once again, as it is now, and for some reason that worked. No idea what happened, so your mileage may vary there. All said, I am once again thrilled with the final product. It works perfectly for me both as a productivity board on my Mac OS computer and as a great gaming board on my Windows machine. For the sound test this time, I have 2 sets. First will just be the board stock, and then the board with the aftermarket keycaps. I think this will be a pretty common mod among newcomers, so I wanted to document that. The second set will be the full chronological order of the modifications as I completed them. I hope this video is helpful, and if you have any questions, please leave me a comment so I can get back to you on it. The final slide of this video will be a breakdown of the cost of the parts, supplies, and tools used to perform these mods. Thanks for watching.